Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we invite you to rest, to let go of your day, and drift back through time into a world hidden behind the palace walls of ancient China. You found your way to a quiet corner of history where stories aren't rushed, where voices are soft, and where even the forgotten are remembered. Here, we don't chase battles or kingdoms. We slow down and wander gently through the silent halls of the past. But before we begin, if you enjoy slow, soothing journeys through the quieter side of history, if you like your bedtime stories whispered from dusty scrolls and long-forgotten places, then please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us share more of these sleepy tales with kind souls like you. You can also tap the bell to be gently reminded whenever a new story is ready for you. Now, breathe slowly. Close your eyes if you like. Let the world fall away and come with us into a story not often told. The tragic, quiet life of a male concubine in ancient China. It began in a small street hidden behind a busy tea house in the southern city of Hangzhou. The alley was narrow, full of smoke from nearby cooking fires and the sound of clinking porcelain. That night, red lanterns hung from every doorpost, not for celebration, but for the new year. Red in hopes of luck, red in hopes of better days. And on that night, a baby boy was born. His mother, a quiet tea servant, whispered a prayer between clenched teeth as she labored on a straw mat. There was no husband by her side, no father in the records, only the midwife and the dim lantern light dancing on the cracked wooden walls. The boy came quietly, no loud cries. His skin was pale like ivory. His hair was dark as ink. When he opened his eyes, the midwife gasped. "So beautiful," she murmured, wiping his face with an old cloth, like a doll. His mother didn't smile. She looked at him for a long time, as if already knowing the world would not be kind to a boy so lovely. They named him Bao, meaning treasure. But in a world ruled by power and rules, beauty in a boy was not always a blessing. As he grew, Bao didn't run wild with the other children in the alley. He stayed near the tea house, helping his mother pour water, carrying empty cups, always quiet, always watching. Customers began to whisper about the little boy with the long lashes and careful hands. Some called him a lucky charm, others called him strange. But one day, a woman from the capital noticed. She was rich and powerful, and she looked at Bao the way a collector looks at a rare gem. And that was the beginning of the end. She came quietly, dressed in soft blue silk, with hair combed high and long sleeves that brushed the ground as she walked. Her servants followed behind like shadows, carrying incense and scrolls. No one knew her name, but the tea house owner bowed so low his forehead touched the floor. She must have been someone important, someone from the capital. She didn't speak much, just sat in the corner, near the window, sipping tea without sugar. Her eyes didn't wander. They studied. Not the walls, not the food, but people. That's when she saw him bow. Only 12 then. He moved like a whisper between tables. He carried a tray of cups with steady hands, never spilling a drop. His eyes were downcast, lips closed, posture perfect. The light hit his face just right as he poured the tea, delicate, silent, practiced. The woman watched him for a long time. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once and said to the tea master, "That boy, where is he from?" The owner hesitated, then answered politely, "The son of a worker, honored guest." The woman said no more. She finished her tea and left. 3 days later, Men in black robes came to the alley. They brought silver, they brought papers with red stamps, and they said the boy had been chosen. His name was on a list from the capital. His mother screamed. She begged. She offered to take his place. But her words meant nothing. The coins were already in the owner's hands. The papers were already signed. Bao didn't fight. He stood still as they took him. His mother wept into her apron. And just like that, the boy who poured tea with such grace disappeared behind a curtain of silk and power. Forever. The journey to the capital was long. Through valleys and hills, through rain and sun, Bao sat quietly inside a carriage. He was not chained, he was not beaten, but he was no longer free. When they reached the city gates, everything changed. Tall walls stretched high above him. Soldiers in red armor guarded every door. The sky looked smaller here, and the world smelled of incense, dust, and something cold and unfamiliar, silk and stone. They took him to a place behind the palace, where many boys like him were kept. Some were older, some younger. All were beautiful, all were silent. This was the school of obedience. There were no toys, no songs, just rules. Many rules. You must bow when spoken to. You must not speak unless asked. You must smile, but only softly. Never show anger. Never raise your voice. And above all, never forget that you belong to someone else now. The teachers were strict, but not cruel. They dressed the boys in fine robes. They taught them calligraphy, how to walk without sound, and how to paint plum blossoms on fans. They practiced the art of Sentho to perfume the skin with powdered herbs. Bao was a fast learner. His movements were graceful, his posture perfect, his voice soft like morning wind. But at night, he would lie awake on the stone bed staring at the ceiling. The other boys cried, quietly, into their sleeves. One tried to escape. He was caught and never returned. Here, Bao learned the deepest lesson. Beauty is a cage. It brings comfort but not safety, praise but not love. And so he obeyed. He followed every rule. He bowed lower, smiled longer, because soon he knew someone powerful would choose him, and he would have no choice at all. Bao had now turned 17. He had grown taller. His hair was longer, tied with golden thread. His skin remained pale and smooth, untouched by sun or hardship. Every movement he made was graceful like wind through bamboo. The teachers were pleased. He had become exactly what they had trained him to be. Then one day, while walking through the imperial garden, everything changed. It was late spring. The peach blossoms had just begun to fall, soft as snow. Bao was carrying a tray of tea, as he often did, when a group of royal women passed by, their laughter trailing behind them like perfume. Among them was the empress. She stopped walking. Her gaze fell on Bao. She said nothing at first, just stared. Then she whispered to her attendant, "He looks like a moon spirit from a scroll painting." The next day, Bao was summoned to the inner court. This was the private world of the palace where the emperor's wives, concubines, and eunuchs lived. No ordinary man was allowed there. Bao was not ordinary anymore. They gave him a room filled with embroidered screens and a silk-covered bed. They dressed him in robes so fine they felt like water against the skin. They even gave him a mirror carved from bronze and framed in jade. But he was not free. He could not leave. He could not refuse. He was now what they called a male companion. A concubine, though the word was never said aloud. He was a man living among women, desired, yet shunned, touched, yet untouchable. Outside, The world believed he had risen in honor. Inside, Bao knew the truth. He had only stepped into a prettier cage. One with silk walls and no doors. A week after arriving in the inner court, Bao was summoned before a scribe and a senior eunuch. The room smelled of fresh ink, sandalwood, and wet paper. It was quiet, except for the scratching of brushes and the flickering of an oil lamp. He was told to kneel. The eunuch spoke softly. From today on, you are no longer Bao. That name belongs to a boy from the tea house. You are now Lan-Yue. Lan-Yue. Moonlight in the Pines. A beautiful name, chosen to match his delicate appearance, but it did not belong to him. Not really. The scribe wrote it carefully onto a scroll next to the names of others who had come before. Dozens, maybe hundreds of concubines, men and women who had been given new names, new roles, and forgotten their old selves. As the ink dried, the eunuch nodded. You are now recorded in the imperial registry. You belong to the palace. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just a name and silence. That night, Lan-Yue stared at the ceiling above his silk-covered bed. He whispered his old name to himself, Bao. It sounded distant, like a bell heard from far away. He remembered the alley, the smell of roasted chestnuts in winter, his mother's hands pouring tea. He would never see her again, never speak to her, never be her son, not officially. In the eyes of the palace, he was no one's child, no one's brother, no one's friend, just a name on a scroll, a possession. The next morning, when a servant asked for his name, he answered without pause, Lan-Yue. It was easier that way, because in the Forbidden City, the less you remembered, the less it hurt. Evenings in the inner court moved slowly like water in a still pond. The sun would dip behind the palace roofs, casting long shadows across the red walls and carved wooden screens. Servants lit lanterns that glowed with soft amber light, and the scent of jasmine floated through the corridors like a dream. Every night, Lan-Yue prepared himself. Whether or not he was summoned, it did not matter. He had to be ready. A maid would bring warm water, and he would bathe in a porcelain tub painted with cranes and lotus blossoms. The water smelled of orange peel and rose petals. Afterward, another servant would dust his body with powdered herbs, clove, sandalwood, a touch of crushed magnolia. His long hair was brushed and tied with silk cords. A thin robe, almost sheer, was draped across his shoulders. His face was left Bareno paint, no powder. The emperor, they said, preferred a natural look in men. And then, the waiting. Lan-Yue would sit alone in a quiet room, a screen between him and the hallway. A single candle flickered beside him. If a eunuch came, he would rise, bow, and follow without a word. If no one came, he would stay there until the candle burned down. Hours would pass in silence. The only sounds were the rustle of silk, the distant calls of night birds, and the muffled footsteps of others being summoned. Sometimes he was chosen, sometimes not, but he could never be sure. That was the cruel part, not knowing, not having control, not even over his own body. The perfume lingered on his skin either way. He had become like the flowers in the emperor's garden, kept in bloom for one man's pleasure. And just like those flowers, he was never allowed to wilt, even in sorrow. It was a cool evening in late autumn. Lan-Yue had been in the inner court for over a year. Days blurred together, full of silence, softness, and watching from behind screens. He had become nearly invisible, but that was the way of things. Men like him were to be seen, not known. Then it happened. He was serving tea in the outer garden during a moon-viewing ceremony. The emperor had come surrounded by guards, scholars, and noble guests. He wore deep purple robes with golden thread, and his face was unreadable, carved like stone. Lan-Yue moved carefully between tables, his head lowered, his tray steady, and then the emperor looked at him. Just a glance, brief, quiet, but it landed like thunder in Lan-Yue's heart. His steps faltered just for a moment, but he recovered, bowed, and turned away. The moment passed. No one else seemed to notice. That night, as he waited beside the flickering candle, a eunuch came to his door. "You are summoned," he whispered. Lan-Yue said nothing. He simply rose and followed. Servants guided him to a different part of the palace. He was bathed again, this time in wine-scented water. His robe was thinner, dyed a pale silver that shimmered under lantern light. He walked barefoot down a long corridor. Every footstep echoed. When he reached the chamber, he bowed deeply before entering. The emperor was there alone, silent. Lan-Yue did not speak. He had been trained for this. There was no kindness, no cruelty, just a ritual, a night meant to please, not to connect. When morning came, Lan-Yue dressed quietly and returned to his room. No one spoke to him. No one asked how it felt. But something inside him had shifted. He was no longer invisible. And somehow, that made him feel more alone than ever. The morning after his summons, Lan-Yue sat in silence. His body was clean, his robe newly folded, but his mind felt heavy like stone resting on silk. The room was quiet, no wind, no bird song, only the soft hiss of a candle burning low beside him. He had thought the night might mean something, that being chosen by the emperor would make him feel special, important, seen. But it didn't. It felt like being touched by a stranger behind a curtain. Cold, mechanical, formal. There had been no words exchanged, no glance of affection, just quiet instructions from a eunuch, and then shadows moving in a perfumed room. Lan-Yue had laid still, like the paintings on the palace walls, beautiful, silent, and without will. It had not hurt, but it hadn't felt right either. He had spent years preparing for that moment, trained to be the perfect concubine, to obey without question, to please without complaint. But afterward, as he walked back to his quarters alone, his bare feet brushing the cold stone floor, he realized the truth. He was not a person. He was an experience. The guards barely noticed him. The servants bowed out of habit, not respect. Even the candle in his chamber flickered indifferently, as if to say nothing has changed. A court scribe came later to record the night. He asked no questions, only wrote Lan-Yue's name and the date in a large red ledger. His Majesty was satisfied? The scribe asked softly. Lan-Yue bowed his head and said, "Yes." The scribe nodded and left, and that was it. There would be no gifts, no promises, no visits, just silence, just waiting again. That night, Lan-Yue did not cry. He had forgotten how. Instead, he laid on his side, stared at the wall, and tried to forget how empty the night had truly been. The inner court was a world built on silence, but whispers always found a way. They moved like wind through silk screens, slipping through doorways, around corners, between servants carrying trays of fruit and letters written in perfume. After Lan-Yue's night with the emperor, the whispers began. "Did you hear? The pale one, he was summoned. He must be favored now." Some voices sounded impressed, others jealous, but most carried something else, fear, because in the Forbidden City, attention could be dangerous. Lan-Yue kept his head low, his voice softer than ever. He smiled gently, bowed deeper, and spoke only when spoken to. But still the whispers grew. The other concubines watched him closely, some with narrowed eyes, others with forced politeness. One of the older women, dressed in faded green silk, warned him quietly. "Rise too quickly," she said, "and the wind will take you." Lan-Yue didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. There were rules in this place, unwritten, sharp as glass. A male concubine was a rarity, a curiosity. He was not protected by rank or title. He was not expected to last. And the emperor's favor was fickle. What pleased him one week might bore him the next. Lan-Yue began to feel the pressure in every step. He was expected to stay beautiful, stay obedient, stay useful, but never become a threat, never be loved too deeply. Each night he waited again by the candlelight, wondering if he would be called. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. But even in the quiet, the whispers did not stop. They followed him like shadows, slipping through walls, hiding behind smiles. And slowly, quietly, Lan-Yue began to understand. In this palace of silk and stone, survival was not about being seen. It was about not being seen too much. In a small wooden box beneath his bed, Lan-Yue kept paper, ink, and a brush. He wasn't supposed to have the male concubines, weren't allowed to write without permission. But he had asked a kind maid once, and she had quietly slipped the materials into his chamber. She didn't ask why, she didn't need to. He used them to write letters. Letters to his mother. At night, when the moonlight crept across the tiled floor and the palace was hushed with sleep, Lan-Yue would light a tiny lamp and sit cross-legged beside it. He would take out the paper, smooth it gently, and begin. "Mother," he would write, "are you well? Is the tea-house still standing? Do you still keep the red lanterns by the door?" He never wrote about the palace, never mentioned the emperor, never described the cold silk beds or the endless waiting. Instead, he wrote about the plum trees, about the scent of the courtyard garden, about Memrisham carrying tea, her humming old songs in the kitchen. He told her he missed the sound of rain on the roof, the laughter of the alley boys, the feel of her hand on his head when he had fevers. Every time he ended with the same line, "I am safe. I think of you every day." Then he folded the letter and tucked it carefully into the bottom of the box. He never sent a single one. If the guards found them, he would be punished. If the letters reached her, she might worry, or worse, be questioned. Still, he wrote them, over and over, because writing helped him remember who he had been. And remembering was the only thing that made him feel alive. Her name was Meishan, though she never said it aloud. She was a court lady distantly related to a noble family, not important enough to be noticed, but too valuable to be forgotten. She wore robes the color of river stones and moved like a breeze across polished floors. Lan-Yue first saw her by the lotus pond. She was feeding the koi with careful fingers, her expression calm and unreadable. He bowed politely, expecting silence. But instead, she looked up and smiled. "You always walk like you're trying not to be seen," she said softly. Lan-Yue blinked, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people speaking to him so freely. Over time, they found quiet moments. Behind garden screens, in narrow hallways, in the still corners of the library where no one paid attention to a concubine and a court lady, she asked questions about his childhood, about tea leaves and music and the names of stars. He answered carefully at first, but slowly he opened up. In her presence, he felt human again. Not just a decoration, not just a body waiting to be chosen. With her, he laughed soft, breathy laughs that surprised even him. For a short while, he believed something gentle might grow between them. But the palace was not a place for gentle things. One morning she was gone, married off to a general in the western provinces. A political match. Lan-Yue was not told. No one mentioned it. He simply saw her absence in the garden, the empty seat in the library. That night, he sat beneath the moon and said her name aloud, just once. He knew they had no future. He knew he had no right to hope. But in those quiet, stolen days, he had felt almost real. And that was enough to make it hurt. Winter came quietly, as it always did in the Forbidden City. The wind grew sharp, slipping through narrow halls and freezing the water in stone basins. Snow dusted the rooftops like powdered sugar, and the peach trees stood bare, their branches like bones. Lan-Yue tried to keep warm, layering robes and drinking hot ginger broth. But no matter how tightly he wrapped himself in silk, the chill found its way to his skin and to his bones. It began as a cough, nothing more. He hid it at first, bowing as usual, keeping his head down. He still waited each evening, still perfumed his skin, still smiled when servants passed. But his cough grew deeper, harsher. His lips cracked, his chest ached. The palace doctors came, but only after 3 days of complaints from nearby chambers. They examined him briefly, pressed his wrist, felt his forehead. Too much cold air, one muttered. Rest and take this tea. The tea was bitter and barely warm. The rest never came. No one brought extra blankets. The fire in his chamber burned low. He was told to recover quietly, without disturbing the schedule. Lan-Yue lay in bed alone, watching frost form patterns on the window pane. His dreams were fevered and strange. He saw his mother pouring tea, the lady in blue standing by the koi pond, the emperor's face, distant and unreadable. For a moment, he thought he might die, but he didn't. After 10 days, the fever passed. The cough softened. He rose again, slower than before, and resumed his place in the quiet halls. But something was different. The emperor never summoned him again. No one looked at him the same way. He had faded just slightly, like an ink stroke left in the rain. Not gone, but forgotten. After the illness, Lan-Yue was quietly moved to another chamber. There was no announcement, no farewell, just a servant arriving one morning with a folded robe and a bowed head. "Please follow me," she whispered. He did. The new room was smaller, tucked behind the servants' hallway, beside a narrow stone path that led to a forgotten garden. The windows were thin, covered in yellowed paper. They let in only a faint, milky light. There were no silk cushions, no embroidered screens, just a bed, a low table, and a faded rug worn thin by years of quiet footsteps. Outside the window, a withered plum tree leaned crookedly, its limbs bent like an old man's fingers. In spring, it might bloom, but for now, it was just wood and shadow. Lan-Yue did not ask why he was moved. He already knew. He was no longer useful, no longer new. His beauty, so carefully polished, protected, and presented, had lost its shine. Now he was a memory. He spent his days sweeping his small space, organizing what few belongings he had. He still bathed, still kept himself tidy. Habit is a strange kind of comfort. At night, he listened to the sounds of the court, bells chiming from distant towers, the rustle of robes, laughter echoing down marble halls. But none of it was for him. He saw new faces passing by. Younger concubines, delicate and polished, their eyes wide with hope or fear. He never spoke to them. Sometimes he saw the lady in blue's reflection in the pond, though he knew she was long gone. Sometimes he thought he heard his mother's voice in the wind, calling him by the name no one used anymore. He whispered it back quietly. Bow, but only when no one could hear. There was a small covered courtyard near the rear of the palace. It wasn't part of any tour, and most nobles never walked that far. It was quiet, shaded, and always cool no matter the season. Lan-Yue found it by accident while following a stray cat one afternoon. There, beneath the shadows of an overgrown wisteria vine, sat 3 old men. Their robes were faded. One had gone blind. Another shuffled stones into patterns on the ground. The third simply sat with his back against the wall, eyes closed, humming something tuneless. They were like ghosts. At first, Lan-Yue didn't speak. He bowed softly and turned to leave. But the man with the stones looked up and said, "You're new to the courtyard." Lan-Yue shook his head. "Not new," he said gently, "just forgotten." The blind man chuckled. "That makes 4 of us." They were all once what he was male companions, chosen in their youth, praised for their looks, summoned to chambers in silk robes. Now they were here, tucked away, too old to serve, too polite to dismiss. They played quiet games, told half-remembered stories. Sometimes they laughed at nothing at all. One of them still wore a comb in his hair from decades ago, given to him by a noblewoman he could barely remember. Another kept a broken fan he once used in a dance for the emperor. They had nothing left but memories, and even those were fading. Lan-Yue began to visit often. He said little. He simply sat and listened. In their quiet company, he felt strangely comforted. There was no need to pretend, no perfume, no expectations. They were like fallen petals, still soft, still beautiful in their way, but no longer part of the bloom. And somehow that honesty was the kindest thing the palace had ever offered him. The days passed slowly now. Lan-Yue still visited the old man in the courtyard. He swept his room, lit incense, brushed his hair each morning, though no one came to see it. His life had become a paterna soft repetition of silence, memory, and careful survival. But some nights, he still wrote. He didn't write letters anymore. Not to his mother, not to anyone. Now, he wrote poems, short ones, just a few lines, nothing grand, just feelings he couldn't say aloud. One evening, as the lanterns outside swayed in the wind, he wrote a poem on a slip of yellow paper. The words came easily. A blossom blooms beyond the wall, unseen. I reached toward it, though I know the wall is tall, the wall is stone. He didn't sign it. He didn't fold it away. He left it on a stone bench near the garden path. It was foolish. But in that moment, he wanted someone in Oin to read something true. The next day, the poem was gone. That night, a eunuch arrived. He did not smile. He carried no candle. "You are being watched," he said simply. The eunuch didn't scold. He didn't threaten. He only stood there, eyes unreadable. Lan-Yue bowed. "I understand." After that, he stopped writing. He burned the ink, crushed the brush, buried the rest of his old letters in the dirt beneath the plum tree. Words, he had learned, were dangerous in the wrong hands. In the palace, feelings were meant to be perfumed and hidden, not pinned to paper like butterflies. He never wrote another poem, but sometimes, in the stillness of his room, he whispered them to himself, quiet verses that vanished into the silence, unseen, unwritten, but real, at least for him. Once a year, the palace held a grand banquet in the Hall of Radiant Peace. Tables stretched from wall to wall, covered in gold-trimmed cloth. Bowls of dumplings, roasted duck, candied lotus, and steaming rice cakes filled the air with warmth and spice. Musicians played soft melodies on strings and flutes. Lanterns swayed gently above, casting a golden glow across 100 waiting faces. That year, Lan-Yue was invited to attend, not as a guest, not even as a performer, just to be there. He dressed in a pale robe, worn at the edges, and stood near the back wall with the other lesser companions, forgotten petals in a garden now too full. The emperor sat at the far end of the hall, surrounded by ministers and favored wives. He looked older, his beard now streaked with gray, his hands slower to move. Lan-Yue watched him in silence. He hadn't seen the emperor up close in years. Once, he had waited for his glance. Now, he waited for nothing. Younger faces sat closer to the front. A boy with red cheeks and wide eyes served wine and was met with laughter. Another recited a poem and received praise. No one looked at Lan-Yue. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He sipped his tea and let the music pass through him like wine through reeds. The feast lasted late into the night. Toasts were made. Wishes for long life and prosperity filled the air. But to Lan-Yue, it all felt like a dream he had once been part of, and now could only watch from behind glass. When the banquet ended, he bowed and walked back to his chamber. No one stopped him. No one said goodbye. He had been present. That was all. In a room full of light and laughter, he was only a shadow. On the morning of his 38th birthday, Lan-Yue woke to soft knocking at his chamber door. A young maid stood outside, bowing low, her face unreadable. In her hands, she held a small red box tied neatly with golden thread. "For you," she whispered, "from the Empress Dowager." Lan-Yue blinked in surprise. He hadn't received a gift in years, not since the early days, when his presence still stirred interest. He took the box gently and returned inside. The door closed with a soft click, muffling the world outside. He sat on the edge of his bed, untying the thread slowly, careful, almost afraid of what he might find. Inside lay a hairpin, delicate, beautiful, carved from ivory with a small jade lotus at the top. A woman's hairpin, meant for long dark hair pinned high. Lan-Yue stared at it for a long time. He wondered if it had been chosen for him, or if it had simply been taken from a drawer. Perhaps the gift was symbolic, or perhaps it was not a gift at all, just a reminder of what he was, what he had been. A man shaped into something soft, decorated, adorned, a flower that had long since been placed in a vase and forgotten. He pressed the hairpin into his palm and held it tightly until his fingers ached. Then he wrapped it in silk and slipped it beneath his pillow. That night, he did not wait by the candle. He did not brush his hair or scent his skin. He sat by the window instead, watching the moon rise over the quiet garden. No one came. No one would. He was no longer wanted. But for one brief moment, he let himself pretend that someone somewhere still saw him, and that was enough to bring tears he had held for years. It happened quietly. One morning the maid came to light his candle, and Lan-Yue did not rise. She called out softly, thinking he had overslept, but there was no answer. The door creaked open, and the cold air touched stillness. He was lying on his side, his face turned toward the papered window, as if still watching the first light of dawn. His hair was unbound, his robe neatly arranged. There was no pain on his face, no sign of fear, just peace, like someone who had finally laid down a burden too heavy to carry. No one knew the exact cause. He had not been sick. There were no wounds. Perhaps it was age, or exhaustion, or the soft, quiet way a candle burns down without anyone noticing. His body was taken away at dusk. There was no ceremony, no music, no final offering of wine or incense. He had no title, no family at court to mourn him. The next day, a court scribe copied his name onto a stone tabletone among many others. It was a long slab, tucked into a shadowed corner of the servant's shrine, names written in small, neat characters. Just names. No stories, no dates of glory or honor. His name read, Lan-Yue, former companion. That was all. No one spoke of him afterward. Life in the palace moved forward as it always did. The younger concubines were still being trained. The emperor had grown older, quieter. The old men in the garden sat on, playing with stones. But in a drawer buried beneath folded linens in a forgotten chamber, the ivory hairpins still remained. And under the plum tree, a single slip of yellowed paper fluttered from a crack in the stone wall. No one saw it, but it was there, still whispering. Far from the palace, beyond the reach of red walls and golden roofs, the tea house still stood. The alley had changed, shops were newer, children louder, and the lanterns had faded with time. But the tea house remained, weathered, leaning slightly but strong, like an old friend who had learned to stay quiet in a noisy world. Inside, an old woman poured tea with steady hands. Her hair had turned silver. Her back was bent now, but her eyes stared as they were still turned toward the doorway each time someone entered, just for a moment, just to see. She didn't speak of him often. The boy she had once called Bao. Some thought she had imagined him. Others thought he had died long ago. But every year, during the first snow, she hung a single red lantern outside the door. Not for the new year, not for guests, just for him. She never remarried. She never left the city. She stayed close, always, in case a letter came, in case a man with soft eyes and careful steps ever walked back through the door. She remembered the day they took him, how he hadn't cried, how he had stood so still, trying to be brave for her. Sometimes, when the tea house was quiet, she would sit by the fire and hum the same lullaby she once sang when he was small, the same one he whispered back to her in his fevered dreams. She didn't know where he had gone. She didn't know who he had become. But in her heart, he was still just Bao, her boy with the careful hands, her treasure. And though the world had forgotten him, she never did. Every cup of tea she poured was, in some quiet way, for him. Seasons passed, and the palace changed. The emperor grew frail. New ministers filled the halls. Young concubines, polished and fresh, whispered where others once walked. But in one corner of the inner court, tucked behind a forgotten corridor, stood a quiet garden. It was small, surrounded by crumbling stone and moss-covered walls. Few visited now. The path was uneven, and the plum tree that once bloomed proudly leaned sideways, its bark dry and cracked. Beside that tree, there remained a bench, weathered by years of rain and sun, the red paint long faded, the wood soft to the touch. No one sat on it anymore. No servant came to clean it, but it remained like a quiet witness. The wind rustled the leaves, lifting small bits of dust into the golden sunlight. Sometimes a gardener passed through. Sometimes a young servant wandered in, chasing a cat. But no one stayed long. The air there was heavy, not sad, exactly, just still. Beneath the bench, a corner of yellowed paper peeked from a crack in the stone, and above, on the wall near the window, faint scratches remained. Not enough to form words, just small mark traces of someone once trying to remember something or not be forgotten. There was no statue, no tablet with stories, no grand monument, but the silence itself held memory. If you stood very still, You could almost feel it, the presence of someone who once waited here each evening, his heart wrapped in perfume and obedience, his voice hidden behind bows and borrowed names. The palace didn't speak of him anymore, but he had been here, in the dust, in the bench, in the wind, through the garden leaves. His story, soft and invisible, was still part of the stone. And sometimes, stillness is the only monument the forgotten ever receive.